What if everything you were taught about economics was fundamentally wrong? What if the economy is not a well-oiled machine that can be fine-tuned by policymakers pulling levers and adjusting interest rates, but something far more alive, far more unpredictable, far more like a rainforest than a factory? This is the mind-bending thesis at the heart of The Origin of Wealth by Eric D. Beinhocker, a book that has fundamentally reshaped how millions of people think about money, markets, innovation, and the very nature of economic progress. In this video, we are going to take a deep and immersive journey into every layer of this extraordinary work, exploring its core ideas, its intellectual background, the critical praise it has received, and a detailed chapter-by-chapter breakdown that will leave you seeing the world of economics in an entirely new light. Let us begin with the central question that drives the entire book: what is wealth, and where does it come from? The conventional economic answer is simple and elegant. Wealth comes from the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Markets, when left to function freely, direct resources to their most productive uses. Supply meets demand, prices adjust, and equilibrium is reached. This is the neoclassical view, the view taught in every introductory economics course, the view that underpins virtually all economic policy around the world. Beinhocker does not merely disagree with this view. He argues that it is so fundamentally flawed that it deserves to be replaced entirely. Instead of seeing the economy as a machine that seeks equilibrium, Beinhocker sees it as a complex adaptive system. This is a concept borrowed from complexity science, the same field that studies how ant colonies coordinate without a central commander, how brains produce consciousness from billions of neurons, and how ecosystems evolve through endless interaction. In a complex adaptive system, there is no central planner, no equilibrium to be found, no predictable path forward. Instead, the system is constantly evolving, constantly adapting, constantly generating novelty in ways that no single agent could have predicted. The economy is not a machine. It is a living, breathing, ever-changing evolutionary process. And wealth, in this framework, is not merely the accumulation of goods and services. Wealth is complexity itself. Every product, every service, every institution, every technology in the economy represents a solution to a problem of survival and prosperity. The more complex the solution, the more wealth is created. The simple stone axe is wealth. The smartphone with millions of lines of code, thousands of components sourced from dozens of countries, and an ecosystem of apps and services is vastly more. Wealth, the origin of wealth, is the origin of complexity. This insight alone is revolutionary, but Beinhocker does not stop there. He traces the entire history of economic thought, from Adam Smith to Karl Marx to Friedrich Hayek, showing how each school of thought captured only a fragment of the truth and how none of them fully grasped the evolutionary nature of the economy. He demonstrates that the neoclassical revolution of the 19th and 20th centuries, with its obsession with equilibrium and mathematical elegance, was a profound detour that led economics astray, and he presents complexity economics as the framework that can restore economics to its proper course, one that acknowledges the messy, creative, unpredictable reality of how economies actually work. To understand why this book matters so much, we need to look at the context in which it was written. The Origin of Wealth was published in 2006, a time when the dominant economic paradigm was firmly rooted in neoclassical assumptions. Central banks around the world operated on the belief that economies could be smoothly managed through monetary policy. Financial markets were celebrated as self-correcting mechanisms. The great bull market of the 1990s and early 2000s was taken as proof that the economy had been tamed, that the business cycle had been conquered. But the seeds of disaster were already being sown. The dot-com bubble had burst in 2000, and while it was absorbed relatively quickly, it should have been a warning sign that the economy was not as stable or predictable as mainstream economists claimed. The assumption that markets were efficient, that prices reflected all available information, that rational actors made rational decisions, was the foundation upon which the entire financial architecture rested, and that foundation was cracking. Beinhocker, who held a PhD in physics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, brought a completely different perspective to economics. His training in physics and complex systems meant that he was not bound by the conventions of the discipline. He saw the economy the way a physicist might see a thermodynamic system or an ecosystem, as a dynamic, evolving, nonlinear system that defies simple mathematical modeling. This outsider perspective was both his greatest strength and, for many in the economics establishment, his greatest sin. The intellectual lineage of the book stretches back to Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist who argued that capitalism is fundamentally a process of creative destruction, where new innovations constantly overthrow old structures. Schumpeter understood that the economy is evolutionary, but his insights were largely ignored by the mainstream. Beinhocker picks up where Schumpeter left off, drawing on decades of research in complexity science, evolutionary biology, and artificial intelligence to build a comprehensive alternative to neoclassical economics. Another important influence on the book is the work of Herbert Simon, who introduced the concept of bounded rationality, arguing that humans are not the perfectly rational actors assumed by neoclassical economics but rather satisficers who make decisions based on limited information and cognitive capacity. This insight, combined with the work of complexity scientists like Stuart Kauffman and Holland, forms the intellectual backbone of Beinhocker's argument. The publication of The Origin of Wealth also coincided with a growing intellectual movement that challenged the orthodox economic consensus. The behavioral economics revolution, led by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, was exposing the irrationality of human decision-making. The complexity economics community, though small, was growing. And the failures of mainstream economics to predict or explain major economic events were becoming increasingly obvious. Beinhocker's book served as a synthesis and a manifesto for this emerging alternative paradigm. Now let us turn to the critical reception of the book. The Origin of Wealth was widely praised by reviewers and scholars who recognized it as a landmark contribution to economic thought. Many called it one of the most important books on economics written in the 21st century, a work that deserved to sit alongside The Wealth of Nations and Capital as a foundational text for a new way of understanding the economy. Critics highlighted the book's ambitious scope, its ability to weave together insights from physics, biology, computer science, and economics into a coherent and compelling narrative. The prose was praised for being accessible and engaging, avoiding the technical jargon that often plagues economics books while still maintaining intellectual rigor. Reviewers noted that Beinhocker has the rare gift of being able to explain complex ideas in ways that are both accurate and exciting. Some reviewers pointed out that the book is not without its limitations. A few argued that the critique of neoclassical economics, while valid, sometimes oversimplifies the diversity of views within the field. Others noted that complexity economics, as presented by Beinhocker, is still a developing framework and that some of its predictions remain untested. But even these critics acknowledged that the book makes an essential contribution to the ongoing debate about the future direction of economic thought. The book has been particularly praised for its historical analysis. Beinhocker's chapter on the history of economic thought is considered one of the most insightful and balanced surveys of the subject available. He does not dismiss earlier economists as simply wrong. Instead, he shows how each school of thought captured important aspects of economic reality while missing others, and how the full picture only emerges when these fragments are integrated into a broader framework. Readers from diverse backgrounds have found the book valuable. Entrepreneurs have appreciated its emphasis on innovation and complexity as the drivers of wealth creation. Policymakers have found its implications for governance and regulation thought-provoking. Students of economics have discovered in it a refreshing alternative to the dry and often misleading mainstream textbooks. And general readers have been captivated by the story it tells about the origins of human prosperity. The book has also sparked important debates within the economics profession. Some mainstream economists have welcomed the challenge to orthodoxy, seeing complexity economics as a natural evolution of the discipline. Others have been more skeptical, arguing that the mathematical tools of complexity science are not yet sufficiently developed to replace the formal models of neoclassical economics. These debates, Beinhocker would argue, are exactly what a healthy and vibrant economic science should look like. Let us now move into a detailed exploration of the book's key chapters and the major ideas they contain. The book is structured in three main parts. The first part establishes the inadequacy of mainstream economics and introduces the alternative framework of complexity economics. The second part traces the history of economic thought, showing how different schools of thought have contributed to our understanding while falling short of a complete picture. The third part applies the complexity framework to specific economic phenomena and policy questions. The first chapter, which serves as an introduction to the entire work, presents a vivid and memorable thought experiment. Imagine a simple economy where people barter goods and services. At first, the economy is simple and static, but as population grows and technology advances, new products emerge, new markets form, and the economy becomes increasingly complex. This complexity is not imposed from above by any central authority. It emerges spontaneously from the interactions of countless individuals pursuing their own goals. This spontaneous emergence of complexity is, Beinhocker argues, the fundamental process of wealth creation. The chapter goes on to explain the three fundamental laws of complexity economics. The first law is that the economy is a complex adaptive system. This means that the economy is composed of many interacting agents, each of whom adapts and learns from experience. The interactions between agents generate emergent properties that cannot be predicted by studying individual agents in isolation. The second law is that the economy is constantly evolving. There is no equilibrium to be reached. The economy is always in a state of flux, constantly generating new products, new technologies, new institutions, and new ways of organizing production and consumption. The third law is that the economy is path-dependent. The history of the economy matters. Past events, decisions, and accidents shape the trajectory of economic development in ways that cannot be predicted from first principles. Building on these three laws, Beinhocker introduces the concept of the evolution of wealth. Just as biological evolution works through variation, selection, and retention, economic evolution also operates through these three processes. New products, technologies, and business models are generated through variation, whether by chance or by deliberate innovation. These variations are then subject to selection by the market. Successful innovations survive and proliferate, unsuccessful ones fail and disappear, and successful innovations are retained through imitation, learning, and institutionalization. This evolutionary framework has profound implications for how we understand economic growth. In the neoclassical view, economic growth is driven by the accumulation of capital and the increase in labor productivity. Innovation is treated as an exogenous factor, something that happens outside the model and is then imported into the analysis. In the complexity view, Innovation is endogenous, it is generated by the evolutionary processes of variation, selection, and retention. Economic growth is not merely an increase in the quantity of goods and services, it is an increase in the quality and complexity of the solutions that the economy generates to the problems of survival and prosperity. The second major section of the book is a sweeping history of economic thought. Bainhocker traces the development of economics from its origins in the 18th century to the present day, showing how each major school of thought has contributed to our understanding while also revealing its limitations. He begins with Adam Smith, the father of economics, and his seminal work The Wealth of Nations. Smith's insight that the division of labor is the primary driver of economic growth remains one of the most important ideas in the history of economic thought. But Smith also recognized that the economy is a complex system driven by human passions and interests, not merely by rational calculation. His vision was richer and more nuanced than the simplified version that has been passed down through the centuries. Bainhocker then examines the contributions of David Ricardo, Karl Marx, and the Austrian School of Economics. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage remains a cornerstone of international trade theory, but his abstract and mathematical approach also set a precedent for the formalization and abstraction that would come to dominate economics. Marx's analysis of capitalism as a dynamic and contradictory system anticipated many insights of complexity economics, particularly the idea that the economy is driven by internal forces of change and development. The Austrian economists, particularly Friedrich Hayek, emphasized the role of knowledge, entrepreneurship, and spontaneous order in the economy, insights that are fully consistent with the complexity framework. The history of economic thought reaches its turning point with the neoclassical revolution of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Economists like Leon Walras, Alfred Marshall, and later Paul Samuelson sought to transform economics into a rigorous mathematical science, modeled on physics. They replaced the dynamic, evolving economy of Smith and Marx with a static model of equilibrium, where supply and demand determine prices and quantities, and where all agents have perfect information and make rational decisions. This mathematical formalization brought economics prestige and respectability, but at a tremendous cost. It stripped the economy of its dynamism, its creativity, its unpredictability, and its evolutionary nature. Bainhocker argues that the neoclassical framework, while useful in certain limited contexts, is fundamentally inadequate for understanding the real economy. The assumption of rational actors is contradicted by decades of research in psychology and behavioral economics. The assumption of equilibrium is contradicted by the persistent volatility and instability of financial markets. The assumption of perfect information is contradicted by the central role of uncertainty and ignorance in economic decision-making, and the assumption that the economy can be modeled as a static system is contradicted by the relentless innovation and change that characterizes economic development. The third section of the book applies the complexity framework to a range of specific topics. One of the most compelling chapters examines the role of institutions in economic development. In the complexity view, institutions are not merely rules imposed from above, they are emergent phenomena, patterns of behavior and organization that arise spontaneously from the interactions of individuals and groups. Successful institutions are those that facilitate the generation and selection of new variations, that promote learning and adaptation, and that provide the stability and coordination necessary for complex economic activity. Bainhocker draws on extensive research in development economics to show how institutions shape economic outcomes. Countries with strong property rights, independent judiciaries, and democratic governance tend to be more prosperous than countries with weak or predatory institutions, but the relationship is not simple or linear. Institutions evolve through the same evolutionary processes as technologies and products. They are selected by the competitive pressures of the global economy, by the needs of growing populations, and by the ideas and values of the people who create and sustain them. Another important chapter examines the role of entrepreneurship in the economy. In the neoclassical view, entrepreneurship is largely absent. The model assumes that all agents have perfect information and make optimal decisions. There is no room for the bold, the innovative, the visionary entrepreneur who sees opportunities that others miss and creates new markets where none existed before. In the complexity view, entrepreneurship is central. Entrepreneurs are the agents of variation, the creators of new products, new technologies, new business models, and new ways of organizing economic activity. They are the driving force of economic evolution. Bainhocker illustrates this with numerous examples from the history of economic development: the invention of the steam engine by James Watt, the creation of the assembly line by Henry Ford, the founding of Apple by Steve Jobs. Each of these innovations represented a radical departure from the status quo, a new variation that was selected by the market and retained through widespread adoption. Without entrepreneurs, there would be no evolution, no progress, no wealth creation. The book also addresses the role of government in a complex economy. This is a topic that has generated considerable debate. Some critics have argued that Bainhocker's framework implies a hands-off approach, that the government should simply get out of the way and let the market work its evolutionary magic, but this is a misreading of the book. Bainhocker does not argue for laissez-faire capitalism. He argues for a government that understands the nature of the economy as a complex adaptive system, and that designs policies accordingly. In a complex economy, government has an important role to play. It can provide the public goods that the market cannot, such as infrastructure, education, and basic research. It can regulate markets to prevent abuse, protect consumers, and promote competition. It can invest in innovation and technology, supporting the generation of new variations. And it can provide a social safety net that protects individuals from the risks of economic evolution, ensuring that creative destruction does not become simply destruction without creativity. But government intervention must be designed with an understanding of complexity. Top-down planning, the kind attempted by socialist economies in the 20th century, is doomed to failure because it cannot replicate the informational and adaptive capabilities of a decentralized market system. At the same time, intervention that ignores the evolutionary dynamics of the economy, that tries to impose static solutions on a dynamic system, is equally likely to fail. The challenge for policymakers is to design interventions that facilitate evolution rather than constrain it, that support the generation and selection of new variations without trying to predict or control outcomes. One of the most fascinating chapters in the book examines the relationship between economics and biology. Beinhocker draws a careful analogy between the evolution of economies and the evolution of species. Both processes involve variation, selection, and retention. Both processes generate increasing complexity over time. Both processes are driven by competition for limited resources, but there are also important differences. Biological evolution operates through genetic inheritance, while economic evolution operates through cultural and technological inheritance. This means that economic evolution can be much faster than biological evolution, that variations can be generated and selected on a timescale of years or decades rather than millions of years. The analogy is not perfect, and Beinhocker is careful to point out the limitations, but the comparison is illuminating, revealing deep structural similarities between the processes that generate biological diversity and the processes that generate economic diversity. Understanding these similarities can help economists learn from the rich insights of evolutionary biology, just as biologists can learn from the insights of economics about competition, adaptation, and resource allocation. The book also tackles the question of economic forecasting, a topic that is of immense practical importance. In the neoclassical framework, economic forecasting is theoretically possible. If the economy is a well-behaved system that tends toward equilibrium, and if agents are rational and have perfect information, then with enough data and the right models, we should be able to predict future economic outcomes with reasonable accuracy. In practice, of course, economic forecasting has been spectacularly unsuccessful. The 2008 financial crisis, which was brewing at the time of the book's publication, would prove to be the ultimate refutation of the neoclassical forecasting paradigm. In the complexity framework, economic forecasting is fundamentally limited. The economy is a complex adaptive system, which means that it is inherently unpredictable. New variations are generated constantly, interactions generate emergent phenomena, and small changes can have large and unpredictable consequences. This does not mean that forecasting is impossible, but it does mean that we should have much lower expectations about the accuracy and reliability of economic forecasts. Policymakers and investors should focus less on predicting the future and more on building resilience and adaptability to deal with whatever the future brings. Another important theme in the book is the relationship between wealth and well-being. Beinhocker argues that the complexity framework provides a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the relationship between economic growth and human flourishing. In the neoclassical view, wealth is measured by GDP, and the assumption is that more GDP means more well-being. But this view is overly simplistic. GDP measures the quantity of economic activity, not the quality. It counts everything that is bought and sold, but it does not distinguish between activities that enhance well-being and activities that diminish it. The complexity view recognizes that wealth is not merely about quantity but about quality and diversity. A diverse and complex economy is more resilient, more innovative, and more capable of generating solutions to the problems of human flourishing. But this does not mean that all growth is good. Growth that increases complexity in the right directions, that generates new capabilities and opportunities, is beneficial. Growth that increases complexity in the wrong directions, that generates pollution, inequality, and social disintegration, is harmful. The challenge is to guide economic evolution in directions that enhance human well-being. The book also addresses the question of inequality, one of the most pressing issues in contemporary economics and politics. Beinhocker argues that inequality is a natural feature of evolutionary systems. In any system where variation and selection operate, some outcomes will be more successful than others. This is true in biology, where some species are more adapted to their environment than others, and it is true in economics, where some individuals and firms are more successful than others. The question is not whether inequality will exist, but how much inequality is acceptable and what policies should be designed to address it. From a complexity perspective, some inequality can be beneficial. It provides the incentives for innovation and effort, the rewards for successful variation, the resources for further investment and development. But excessive inequality can be detrimental. It can stifle the generation of new variations by limiting the opportunities available to large segments of the population. It can undermine the social cohesion and trust that are necessary for a complex economy to function, and it can lead to political instability and the capture of institutions by powerful interests, which can distort the evolutionary process in ways that benefit the few at the expense of the many. The final major section of the book turns to the implications of complexity economics for public policy. Bainhocker argues that policymakers need to think differently about the role of government, the design of institutions, and the evaluation of policy interventions. The traditional approach of fine-tuning the economy through fiscal and monetary policy is inadequate for a complex system. Instead, policymakers should focus on shaping the evolutionary environment, creating the conditions that facilitate innovation, competition, and adaptation. This means investing in education and research, building infrastructure that supports economic complexity, protecting property rights and enforcing contracts, promoting competition and preventing monopolies, and providing social safety nets that protect individuals from the risks of economic change. It also means being humble about the ability to predict and control economic outcomes, and being willing to experiment, learn, and adapt policies as new information becomes available. One of the most powerful arguments in the book is that the complexity framework can help us understand the success and failure of different economic systems. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in the late 20th century was not merely a political failure, it was an economic failure. A failure of a system that tried to replace the evolutionary dynamics of the market with central planning. Central planners could not generate the variation necessary for economic progress. They could not select the successful variations through market competition, and they could not retain and diffuse the knowledge generated by successful innovations. The result was economic stagnation and eventual collapse. Conversely, the economic success of countries like the United States, China, and India can be understood in terms of their ability to generate and select economic variations. The United States has long been a leader in innovation, with a culture that celebrates entrepreneurship and a system that rewards successful variation. China's economic transformation since the late 1970s has been driven by its willingness to experiment with new policies, to allow market forces to operate, and to learn from its mistakes. India's emergence as a major economic power has been fueled by its entrepreneurial culture, its skilled workforce, and its integration into the global economy. The Origin of Wealth is not merely an academic exercise. It is a book with profound implications for how we think about the world and how we act in it. By understanding the economy as a complex adaptive system, we can develop better policies, make better decisions, and create a more prosperous and equitable world. We can move beyond the simplistic and often misleading models of neoclassical economics and embrace a richer, more realistic, and more hopeful vision of economic life. Bainhocker's writing style is one of the book's greatest strengths. He has a gift for making complex ideas accessible without sacrificing depth or accuracy. He uses vivid examples and analogies to illustrate abstract concepts. He tells stories about real people and real events that bring the ideas to life, and he writes with passion and conviction, conveying his enthusiasm for the subject matter and his frustration with the limitations of the mainstream economic paradigm. The book is also remarkable for its interdisciplinary scope. Bainhocker draws on insights from a wide range of fields, including physics, biology, computer science, psychology, history, and philosophy. This interdisciplinary approach is not merely decorative. It is essential to the argument. The complexity framework is itself an interdisciplinary framework, drawing on the insights of many fields to build a comprehensive understanding of the economy. Bainhocker demonstrates that economics cannot be understood in isolation from other disciplines, that the problems of the economy are fundamentally interconnected with the problems of the natural world and human society. One of the most compelling arguments in the book is about the nature of economic models themselves. Bainhocker argues that models are not merely tools for prediction and policy analysis, they are also frameworks for thinking, for organizing our understanding of the world, for generating new insights and questions. The choice of model matters enormously. Neoclassical models, with their assumptions of rationality, equilibrium, and perfect information, generate a particular set of insights and policy recommendations. Complexity models, with their emphasis on evolution, adaptation, and emergence, generate a very different set of insights and recommendations. The book also addresses the question of economic ethics. Bainhocker argues that the complexity framework has important ethical implications. If the economy is a complex adaptive system, then economic policies should be evaluated not only by their efficiency but also by their impact on the diversity, resilience, and adaptability of the system. Policies that increase diversity and adaptability are generally good. Policies that reduce diversity and adaptability are generally bad. This ethical framework is more nuanced and comprehensive than the utilitarian framework of neoclassical economics, which reduces all value to utility maximization. Another important theme is the role of culture and ideas in economic evolution. Bainhocker argues that culture is a crucial mechanism of economic evolution. Alongside genetic evolution and technological innovation, cultural traits, such as norms, values, and beliefs, are transmitted from generation to generation through learning and imitation. Successful cultural traits tend to persist and spread. Unsuccessful ones tend to die out. Cultural evolution interacts with economic evolution in complex ways, shaping the direction and pace of economic development. The book also examines the role of networks and connectivity in the economy. In a complex adaptive system, the pattern of connections between agents is as important as the agents themselves. Networks determine how information flows, how innovations spread, how shocks propagate. Dense and diverse networks tend to be more innovative and resilient than sparse and homogeneous networks. This has important implications for urban planning, for the design of organizations, and for the development of digital platforms and social media. Bainhocker also addresses the question of global economic integration. The increasing interconnectedness of the world economy is one of the defining features of the 21st century. From a complexity perspective, globalization can be understood as an increase in the connectivity and diversity of the global economic system. This can generate significant benefits, as innovations and ideas spread more rapidly across borders, and as countries specialize according to their comparative advantages. But it can also generate significant risks, as shocks in one part of the system can propagate rapidly to other parts, and as the increased complexity of the system can make it more fragile and unpredictable. The book concludes with a powerful argument for the importance of economic education reform. Bainhocker argues that the way economics is taught in universities around the world is a major obstacle to the adoption of the complexity framework. Students are taught neoclassical economics as if it were the complete and final truth, without any exposure to alternative perspectives. This creates a generation of economists and policymakers who are ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of the real economy. The solution, Bainhocker argues, is to reform economics education to include a broader range of perspectives, to emphasize the limitations of existing models, and to encourage students to think critically and creatively about economic problems. The Origin of Wealth is a book that demands to be read slowly and carefully. It is not a book that can be skimmed or summarized in a few paragraphs. Its ideas are deep and nuanced, and they unfold gradually over the course of the book, but the effort of reading it is richly rewarded. The book changes the way you think about the economy, about wealth, about progress, and about the future of humanity. It is a book that speaks to our times, in an era of rapid technological change, of growing inequality, of environmental crisis, of political polarization, and of financial instability. The complexity framework offers a more realistic and more hopeful vision of economic life. It reminds us that the economy is not a machine to be controlled but a living system to be nurtured and guided. It reminds us that wealth is not merely about money but about the complexity and diversity of solutions to the problems of human flourishing, and it reminds us that the future is not predetermined but is shaped by the choices we make and the institutions we build. If you are looking for a book that will challenge your assumptions, expand your understanding, and inspire you to think more deeply about the world around you, The Origin of Wealth is an essential read. Eric D. Bainhocker has written a masterpiece that deserves to be studied, discussed, and debated. It is a book that changes everything you thought you knew about economics, and in doing so, it changes everything you thought you knew about wealth, about progress, and about the possibilities of human civilization. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most important books of our time.